There are moments in American politics when the ground doesn't just shake, it breaks. And in Minnesota, over the past few days, the break has been loud enough to rattle Washington, terrify Ilhan Omar's inner circle, and trigger one of the most aggressive federal responses we've seen in years. Because what investigators uncovered wasn't just fraud, it wasn't just corruption, it wasn't even just another welfare scandal, it was something far darker. Minnesota taxpayer money traced into the hands of a foreign terrorist organization. And the moment President Trump got briefed, he didn't hesitate. He didn't stall. He ordered what some are calling a direct federal takeover of the situation, including an immediate termination of protected status for nearly 1,000 Somali nationals. And when Ilhan Omar heard it, her reaction said everything. The panic, the denial, the collapse. Today, we're going to break down exactly what happened, why Minnesota erupted, how the fraud was tied to terror, and why Trump's response is sending shockwaves through the political world. So let me walk you through this step by step. Because what's unfolding right now isn't just a Minnesota story, it's a turning point for the entire country. You know, when I first heard about this, my initial thought was, how does something this big stay hidden for so long? How do you have fraud at this scale with this many people involved? And it doesn't trigger alarms earlier, but then you start looking at the details and you realize this wasn't an accident. This wasn't a few bad actors slipping through the cracks. This was a coordinated network operating in plain sight, exploiting every loophole they could find. And that's what makes it so alarming. Because when investigators finally connected the dots, they didn't just find stolen welfare dollars, they found a pipeline, a system that was funneling American taxpayer money overseas, straight into territories controlled by one of the most dangerous terrorist groups in East Africa. Think about that for a second. Programs designed to help hungry kids, seniors who need housing support, families struggling to make ends meet, all of it getting hijacked and redirected. Not just stolen for personal gain, though there was plenty of that too, but actually flowing into the hands of people who actively want to harm us. Now, the scale of what we're talking about here is staggering. Federal prosecutors have filed charges against somewhere between 70 and 80 individuals so far, and we're not talking about small-time theft. The total amount involved well over $250 million. Let that sink in. $250 million, maybe more, taken from programs meant to feed children and house vulnerable Americans. And here's the thing that really gets me. This wasn't a sophisticated high-tech operation. It wasn't hackers breaking into secure databases or masterminds manipulating complex financial instruments. It was simpler than that. And in some ways that makes it worse, because it means the systems we have in place, the safeguards we assume are protecting taxpayer money, they just weren't working, or maybe they were being ignored. Let me give you an example of how brazen this whole thing was. There was one operation they called a safari restaurant that claimed to be serving thousands of meals every single day. We're talking about feeding what would amount to a small army of children 7 days a week. But when investigators looked at their actual food expenses, barely a couple thousand. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to feed a large group of people, but I can tell you, you can't feed an army on that kind of budget. You just can't. The math doesn't work. But it can disguise something else entirely. It can create the appearance of a legitimate operation, while the real money gets channeled somewhere completely different. And that's exactly what was happening. The operation was acting like a central hub, taking in federal nutrition dollars and then pushing them out through what they called charitable operations. But these weren't charities in any real sense. They were vehicles for moving money. And once you understand that basic structure, everything else starts to make sense. The impossible numbers, the fake documentation, the shell companies operating out of mailbox addresses. One of the more recent arrests really drives this home. There was an individual who had already been kicked out of a federal assistance program years ago for suspected fraud. Already caught, already flagged, and yet somehow Minnesota officials approved him to receive child nutrition funds. He went on to wire over $100,000 overseas, paid tens of thousands in kickbacks, and even bought property using stolen funds. How does that happen? How does someone with a documented history of fraud get approved for more federal money? That's the question a lot of Minnesota residents are asking right now, and they're not getting good answers. Then there's another case that's almost comical in how absurd it is, except it's not funny at all when you think about what it represents. There was a defendant operating out of a small town claiming to serve 6,000 meals a day. 6,000 in a town with half that population. Think about the logistics of that for a second. Even if every single person in that town, every man, woman, child, and infant, ate 2 meals from this program every day, the number still wouldn't add up. But nobody caught it. Or if they did, they didn't act on it. This isn't fraud. This is a criminal ecosystem, and it operated for years, growing larger and more brazen with each passing month because the oversight just wasn't there. Or worse, because people who should have been watching decided to look the other way. But here's where things take a darker turn. Because as massive as this welfare fraud was, investigators started noticing something else. Money wasn't just being stolen and spent on luxury items or property or kickbacks. A significant portion of it was leaving the country entirely, flowing back to Somalia through informal money transfer networks. Now, you might think, okay, people sending money back to their home country to support family, that's not inherently criminal, right? And you'd be correct. Remittances are a normal part of the global economy. Millions of people around the world send money back home to help relatives. But here's the problem. When you're using informal channels to move money, especially into regions controlled by militant groups, those transactions don't go untaxed. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab, which is linked to Al-Qaeda and designated as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States, controls significant territory, and they fund their operations in part by taxing money that flows through their areas. It's essentially a terror tax. Every transaction that passes through their informal financial networks gets a cut taken off the top, and that cut goes directly into funding their activities. Activities that include attacks on civilians, destabilizing governments, and yes, targeting Americans and American interests. So, when federal counterterrorism officials trace portions of the stolen welfare money through remittance channels into Al-Shabaab-controlled territory, the entire situation changed. It wasn't just fraud anymore, it was a national security breach. And that's what landed on President Trump's desk. Not just a report about welfare fraud in Minnesota, but an assessment that American taxpayer dollars, money meant to feed hungry children, was ending up in the hands of terrorists. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were the president and someone put that briefing in front of me, I'd want immediate action. And that's exactly what happened. The response was swift and decisive. Trump terminated temporary protected status for close to 1,000 Somali nationals living in Minnesota, effective immediately. No grace period, no appeals process. Because in his administration, national security comes first every single time. He made his position crystal clear in his public comments. He said, Somalis have caused a lot of trouble. They're ripping us off for a lot of money. There's a tremendous amount of money going back to Somalia. And his question was simple. Why are we paying money to Somalia? What are we getting in return for this? He also called out Ilhan Omar directly, saying, she does nothing but complain about our country and our constitution, and she comes from a country that's devastated and crime-ridden. He said, the country is a disgrace, and we took their people in, and we're not taking them anymore. We're getting a lot of them out, because they're nothing but trouble. Now, those are strong words, but they reflect a fundamental shift in how this administration views the situation. It's not about being anti-immigrant or targeting a specific community. It's about accountability. It's about saying, if you come to this country, if we extend our generosity and our systems of support to you, you don't get to abuse that trust. You don't get to steal from us and then act like you're the victim when you get caught. And that's where Ilhan Omar's reaction becomes so telling, because instead of expressing outrage at the fraud, instead of condemning the people who stole hundreds of millions of dollars from programs meant to help children, instead of demanding accountability and transparency, she went on the defensive. Her response was immediate and emotional. She held a press conference and declared that there is not a single piece of evidence that taxpayer money from Minnesota has gone to aid terrorism. She called the investigations racist, xenophobic, and immoral. She said, we cannot blame the lawlessness of an individual on a whole community. And she framed the entire situation as persecution, as a political attack, as Trump and his supporters lying about and scapegoating the Somali community. But here's the thing, and this is important. Her own political foundation is built on that very community. Her district, her fundraising networks, her supporters, they're deeply embedded in the same Minneapolis Somali population that's now at the center of the largest welfare fraud case in American history. So when indictments start dropping, when arrests start happening, when people start getting convicted, every single one of those cases threatens her credibility. Everyone tightens the noose around her political future. She's not defending abstract principles of justice or civil rights. She's defending her base. She's defending the structure that keeps her in power. And that desperation is showing. You can see it in her face, hear it in her voice. This isn't the confident, progressive firebrand we're used to seeing. This is someone who knows the walls are closing in. And those walls are closing in fast because Minnesota Republicans have had enough. Members of Congress from Minnesota, we're talking about representatives like Tom Emmer, Michelle Fischbach, Brad Finstad, Pete Stabber, they formally demanded that the Department of Justice open a full federal terrorism investigation. They want to know, were Minnesota taxpayers inadvertently funding terrorism? And if so, who knew? Who allowed it to happen? Who looked the other way? This isn't political theater. This is elected officials from both parties, though mostly Republicans at this point saying enough is enough. This is a direct threat to America, not just a local corruption issue. And they want answers, real answers, not excuses, not deflections, not lectures about racism. They want to know how 70 plus people got indicted, how a $250 billion got stolen, and how none of the oversight mechanisms caught it until it became a national embarrassment. Meanwhile, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Justice, and the Treasury Department are now moving in lockstep. They've been ordered to dismantle every remittance pipeline that could be feeding terror networks abroad. They're reviewing vetting standards for refugees and asylum seekers. They're looking at whether remittance networks should be reclassified as monitored financial channels because of this terrorist taxation issue. The days of sending money overseas with no oversight, those are over. This case forced America to wake up. And once you wake up to the reality that your generosity is being exploited, that your systems are being gamed, that your tax dollars are ending up in the hands of people who want to harm you, you can't just go back to sleep. You have to act. And that action is creating a political firestorm in Minnesota. Because ordinary people, working class Mountains, Democrats, independents, moderates, people who maybe voted for Ilhan Omar in the past, they're furious. They're asking how hundreds of millions in child nutrition funds could just vanish while the state looked the other way. They're demanding accountability after learning that their money ended up in al-Shabaab territory. They want someone to answer this. And calls for Omar's resignation are growing louder every day. Some people are even talking about recall mechanisms, exploring whether there's a legal path to remove her before the next election. This isn't partisan outrage anymore. This is a multiracial working class rebellion from people who feel robbed, betrayed, and deliberately kept in the dark. You have to understand something about the political landscape in Minneapolis right now. Omar's district has one of the largest Somali populations in the United States. It's the foundation of her coalition. Many of the people who helped her get elected, who organized for her, who raised money for her, they come from that community. And now that same community is at the center of the largest welfare fraud investigation in American history. Every new arrest threatens her credibility. Every new indictment tightens the rope because these aren't strangers. These aren't people from across the country. These are individuals from her own constituency, from her fundraising circles, from the networks that helped put her in Congress. And voters are starting to ask a very uncomfortable question. What did she know, and when did she know it? Now, I'm not saying she was directly involved, but what people are wondering is, how could something this massive be happening in her own backyard, in her own community, and she had no idea? How could she not see the warning signs? Or if she did see them, why didn't she speak up? Why didn't she demand investigations? Why didn't she call for accountability before it became a national scandal? Those are fair questions. And the fact that she's responding with anger and accusations rather than transparency and cooperation, that's not helping her case. It's making her look defensive. It's making her look like she's more interested in protecting her political base than in protecting the integrity of federal programs or the safety of American citizens. And here's where things get really interesting. Because this isn't just about Ilhan Omar. This is about a much bigger ideological battle that's playing out across the country. It's about identity politics versus national security. It's about tribal loyalty versus American citizenship. It's about whether we prioritize protecting specific ethnic communities or protecting the nation as a whole. Omar's entire worldview is built on a post-American ideology. And I don't say that lightly. It's a belief system that sees America as fundamentally illegitimate. As a country built on exploitation and oppression under this framework, taking from America isn't theft, it's restitution, it's justice, it's taking back what was stolen. And loyalty doesn't flow to the nation. It flows to your ethnic identity group, to your tribe, to your community of origin. That's why she can stand in front of a crowd and say, Somalis are not terrorizing this nation. We are the fabric of America, while simultaneously telling her own community in private that she wants to go back to Somalia to raise her children. Those two statements reveal the fundamental contradiction at the heart of her political identity. She's American when it's convenient, when it serves her political purposes, but her true allegiance, her real loyalty, lies elsewhere. Now, compare that to Trump's message. His framework is simple. America must defend itself. National loyalty is the standard. Terror-linked fraud gets zero tolerance. If you come to this country, you're expected to assimilate, to contribute, to become American, not just in name but in spirit. And if you abuse our generosity, if you exploit our systems, if you send our money to groups that want to harm us, you don't get to stay. One narrative weakens the country, the other protects it. And polling shows Americans overwhelmingly side with Trump on this, because when taxpayer dollars end up in terror control territory, people don't care about identity politics. They want security, they want accountability, they want their government to put Americans first. But here's what's really concerning federal investigators. They're warning that Minnesota might just be the tip of the iceberg. They're finding evidence that similar Somali-linked fraud rings may be operating quietly in other states, exploiting the same loopholes, using the same tactics. The systems that failed in Minnesota exist in other places, too. The same weak oversight, the same loose criteria, the same reluctance to ask hard questions for fear of being called racist. And that's exactly what these criminal networks count on. They count on people being afraid to enforce the rules. They count on bureaucrats looking the other way to avoid controversy. They count on activists screaming discrimination the moment anyone tries to verify whether programs are being used properly. So now, for the first time in years, federal regulators are openly discussing whether remittance networks should be reclassified as monitored financial channels because of this terrorist taxation issue. Because of the national security implications, the government is considering whether money flowing to certain high-risk countries needs to be tracked and regulated the way we track other financial transactions that could fund terrorism. The days of sending money overseas with no oversight, no questions asked, those days are ending. This case forced America to wake up. And once you understand that hostile groups are exploiting your generosity, you can't just ignore it. You have to close the loopholes, you have to tighten the vetting, you have to protect the homeland. And under this administration, national security is not negotiable. It's a priority, which means TPS protections for other high-risk countries are now under review. Refugee vetting standards that were relaxed for years are tightening again under President Trump, and states are being put on notice. If you can't manage federal programs responsibly, if you can't prevent fraud at this scale, the federal government will step in. The scandal isn't just reshaping Minnesota, it's reshaping the entire national immigration debate, because it is proving something that many Americans have suspected for a long time, but were afraid to say out loud. Not everyone who comes here wants to be American. Some people want to exploit America. They want the benefits, the security, the opportunity, but they don't want the responsibility. They don't want the assimilation. They don't want to leave their old loyalties behind. And when that happens, when you import people from countries built on corruption, violence, and tribal conflict, and you don't require them to adapt to American values, you end up importing those same problems. You end up with parallel systems with divided loyalties, with communities that see America as something to be exploited rather than protected. Now, I want to be very clear about something. This is not about all immigrants. It's not about all Somalis. There are plenty of Somali Americans who came here, worked hard, assimilated, and became proud Americans. People who love this country, who contribute to their communities, who reject the criminal networks that give their community a bad name. And those people are being hurt by this scandal just as much as anyone else, maybe more, because now they have to live with the stigma. They have to deal with the suspicion. They have to answer for crimes they didn't commit, committed by people they don't associate with. And that's deeply unfair. But the solution isn't to ignore the problem. The solution is not to pretend that massive welfare fraud tied to terrorism is not happening just because it makes some people uncomfortable. The solution is accountability, real accountability for everyone. And that accountability is coming because as we move into early 2026, Ilhan Omar is facing the most vulnerable moment of her entire political career. Minnesota Democrats are privately panicking. They don't know how to defend her. They don't know how to separate themselves from the scandal without looking like they're abandoning a prominent woman of color. They're trapped. Meanwhile, GOP challenges are already lining up. They're backed by a fired-up base and a national security message that cuts through every demographic. They're talking to voters who feel betrayed. They're talking to working families who are struggling to make ends meet while watching hundreds of millions of dollars get stolen from programs meant to help them. They're talking to parents who worry about safety, about terrorism, about whether their government is more interested in protecting foreign nationals than protecting American citizens. And even left-leaning voters are voicing frustration over the fraud, over the excuses, over the deflection. They're tired of being told that asking questions is racist. They're tired of being told that demanding accountability is xenophobic. They're tired of watching their community suffer while politicians play identity politics games. For the first time since she was elected, Omar's seat isn't just contested, it's endangered, and everyone in Washington knows it. The question isn't whether she'll face a serious challenge. The question is whether she can survive it, because the battlefield is shifting fast. The scandal is no longer winding down. Federal agents are warning that more indictments are coming. More money trails are being uncovered. More exposure is on the way, and Omar is standing right in the blast zone. Her district has become a symbol of what happens when post-American politics collides with real-world national security. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, you start to see what this really represents. This isn't just about Minnesota. This isn't just about one congresswoman or one community. This is about a fundamental question facing our entire country. Are we going to be a nation built on shared values and common loyalty? Or are we going to become a collection of ethnic power blocks competing for resources and influence? Are we going to demand that people who come here actually become American? Or are we going to accept parallel systems where loyalty belongs to foreign countries, foreign tribes, foreign causes? Are we going to enforce our laws equally and fairly? Or are we going to have different standards based on someone just whose ethnic background or political connections? Those are the stakes. And Minnesota has become ground zero for answering those questions. The fraud network is unraveling. The terror links are confirmed. And the walls around Ilhan Omar's political empire are collapsing faster every single day. Now, the next few months are going to be critical because this story is far from over. There are more indictments coming. There are more investigations expanding into other states. There are policy changes being implemented at the federal level that will reshape how we handle refugee vetting, remittances, and fraud prevention. And there's an election coming in 2026 that could fundamentally alter the political landscape in Minnesota. The country is watching. Americans are demanding answers. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like those answers might actually come because the Trump administration isn't backing down. They're not apologizing. They're not playing the usual Washington games where everyone pretends to be outraged for a few days and then moves on. They're treating this as what it is, a national security emergency. They're mobilizing federal resources. They're cutting off protection status. They're investigating remittance networks. They're demanding accountability from state officials who let this happen. And they're making it clear that America will not fund terrorism directly or indirectly ever again. That's a powerful message, and it's resonating with voters across the country, not just in Minnesota, because people are tired. They're tired of being taken advantage of. They're tired of seeing their generosity exploited. They're tired of watching criminals get away with massive fraud because enforcing the law might be politically inconvenient. And so, what started as a welfare fraud investigation has become something much larger, has become a turning point, a moment where America has to decide what kind of country it wants to be. A country that protects its citizens and defends its values, or a country that's too afraid of being called names to enforce its own laws. And based on what we're seeing unfold in Minnesota right now, based on the federal response, based on the grassroots anger and the political realignment that's happening, it looks like America is choosing the former. It's choosing accountability. It's choosing security. It's choosing to put its own citizens first. So, if you found this breakdown helpful and you want to stay ahead of what's coming next in Minnesota, because this story is far from over, make sure you hit that like button so more people can see what really happened. Subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this unfolding national story. And drop a comment below. Do you think Trump's response was the right move? I genuinely want to hear your thoughts, because we're living through a moment that's going to define American politics for years to come. And the choices we make now, the accountability we demand now, the standards we enforce now, those are going to determine what kind of country we leave to the next generation. So let's make sure we get it right. Stay informed, stay engaged, and let's keep demanding the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might.